The third step of the porch was the one that had killed his grandfather. Not directly. The silicosis did that, in a hospital ward in Bluefield in the spring of 1956. But the third step was where the old man had stopped, on the last morning he ever walked away from the cabin, and turned to look back at the kitchen window, where his wife stood watching him go. Mason Reeves set his rucksack down on that step and felt the wood give a quarter inch under his weight. He looked up at the same kitchen window. There was no one inside. There had not been anyone inside since the cousin who held the deed had nailed the screen door shut in 2006. The Malinois beside him, a 7-year-old female named Kaiser, Marsoc multi-purpose canine on a contract that had ended 3 weeks earlier, sat without being told. She watched the tree line across the holler the way she watched everything, as a problem to be solved later. Kaiser had not whined once on the 4-hour drive from Beckley. She had not whined when he opened the truck door and the smell of old hardwood and coal dust came up from the ground. She did not whine now. But her ears were forward, and her weight was on her front paws, and Mason knew enough about her to know that she had already counted the angles of approach to the porch and had not liked the count. Per team's doctrine, you cleared a building corner first and door last. Mason did neither. He sat down on the second step, took the deed out of his jacket pocket, and read his cousin's letter one more time. 2 weeks, the cousin had written. 2 weeks to walk the parcel, check the cabin for whether anything is salvageable, decide if we sell to the holding company or to the State Forest Extension, and let me know. The cousin had signed it with the kind of brisk handwriting a man uses when he is sorry he ever inherited his half of a thing. The holding company had offered $46,000 for the 4 acres and the Tippleside cabin. The Forest Extension had offered nothing in cash and a lifetime usage right that did not transfer. Mason had not told his cousin which way he was leaning, because at the time the letter arrived, he had not been leaning either way. He had been on his second beer at a bar in Virginia Beach, 3 days after the discharge paperwork, with his right knee swollen the size of a softball and his left hand still shaking from the IED in Coast the previous summer. And the cabin had not seemed real. It seemed real now. The cabin was a coal camp pattern book unit from the Pocahontas Fuel Company, built in 1948 on a quarter-acre cut into the hillside above what had been the No. 3 drift mine on the Pocahontas No. 3 seam above Bishop. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above, a small kitchen lean-to on the east side. A root cellar dug into the bank behind the cabin, with its own banked soil entry. The tipple itself had been pulled down in 1972. What was left of it was a slumped foundation of fieldstone and 2 upright timbers that the laurel had grown over. Mason had been 4 years old the last time he came up this holler with his father, in the summer of 1989, to bury his grandmother beside his grandfather under the bur oak at the edge of the corn patch behind the cabin. He did not remember the burial. He remembered, or thought he remembered, his father lifting him onto the porch and saying something he could not now reconstruct. He remembered the smell of the cabin. He remembered a dog, not his, sitting on this same third step. He remembered the bedroom floor in the small back room, the square outline of a hand-pegged trapdoor his grandfather had cut in 1948, and which his father had pointed at with the toe of his work boot. The cabin and the dog and the trapdoor had been the only things from that day that had stayed clean in his memory through 23 years on the teams. Kaiser stood up. She had heard something. Mason heard it 3 seconds later, a truck on the Holler road, climbing in second gear, downshifting at the washout before the Laurel turn. He did not move. The truck cleared the turn and came into view through the trees. A faded blue Ford F-150 from somewhere in the 90s, with primer patches on the driver's side and a wooden toolbox bolted to the bed. It pulled up at the gate. An old man in a green John Deere cap got out slow, the way a man gets out who has bad hips and knows it. He stood at the gate without coming through. Mason raised one hand. The old man raised one back. "You'll be Reeves' grandson," the old man said. It was not a question. Mason said he was. The old man nodded once, took the cap off, smoothed his white hair back, put the cap on again. "Carl Sizemore," he said. "I worked the No. 3 with your granddad in 51 and 52, before the dust took him." Mason said he was glad to meet him. Carl Sizemore looked at Kaiser the way an old hillman looks at a serious dog, with the kind of respect that does not require any words. He said, "Boyd Everett's nephew was up here last Tuesday. asking after the cabin. Mason said he did not know who Boyd Everett was. Carl Sizemore looked at him for a long second. Then he said, "Then I reckon I'd best tell you before somebody else does." What Carl Sizemore told Mason, sitting on the second step of the porch with Kaiser between them and the late afternoon light going amber along the high ridge, was the part of the cabin's history that had not made it into the cousin's letter from Beckley. After Mason's grandmother had died in 1989, the cabin had stood empty for 14 years. The cousin who held the deed lived in Charlotte and came up once a year to check that the roof was still on and pay the property tax. In 2003, the cousin had let a man named Boyd Everett rent the cabin for $120 a month on a verbal handshake at Olafson's store down in the Holler mouth. Boyd Everett had been 31 years old in 2003. He had come back from the Marine Corps Reserves with a shoulder that would not heal right and a habit of starting fistfights at the VFW that the VFW had eventually asked him to stop bringing inside. He was kin to the Reeves on his mother's side, 3 generations removed. He moved into the cabin in May of 2003 with a German Shepherd named Della and a chest freezer and a Coleman lantern and what Carl Sizemore called the apparatus. Carl did not name the apparatus directly. He said only that Boyd had been making what his grandfather and his uncles had made before him, in the same hollers, using the same spring water off the same hillside, and that the federal government took a great deal more interest in it now than it had in 1948. Boyd had worked at it for 14 years. He had not gotten rich. He had paid his rent in cash every March when the cousin came up, and he had not been arrested, and he had not been beaten, and he had not been shot. And 3 sheriffs and 2 state ATF agents who had wanted to find his still had not found it. In November of 2019, Boyd Everett had been found dead at the bottom of the cellar steps of the cabin, with a broken neck and a blood alcohol level that the county coroner had recorded as .31. The death had been ruled accidental. The cousin in Charlotte had nailed the screen door shut and not come back. Boyd's only surviving kin was a nephew named Dale Everett, who lived in Princeton, West Virginia, and who, Carl Sizemore said, had been up the Holler last Tuesday afternoon walking the property line. Mason asked Carl why Dale Everett would be walking the property line if Dale Everett had no claim on the cabin. Carl Sizemore looked at the bur oak above the corn patch for a long moment. He said that there were things Boyd Everett had left in the cabin that Boyd had not put in his will, because Boyd had not made a will, because Boyd had been the kind of man who did not believe he was going to die. Carl said that Dale Everett had been to see him on Wednesday morning at his house at the Holler mouth. Dale had asked Carl whether the cabin's new owner had moved in yet. Carl had said no. Dale had asked whether anyone had been inside the cabin since Boyd died. Carl had said no, not as far as he knew. Dale had nodded and said, "Good." Then Dale had asked Carl whether Carl remembered the original layout of the cabin's bedroom floor. Carl had said he did. Dale had said, "Good" again, and had left without explaining further. Mason did not say anything for a while. He watched a chimney swift circle once over the ridge and dive into the dead chimney of the tipple foundation. He could feel his right knee starting to lock in the cool air. Kaiser had her head on his thigh, which she did only when she had decided a place was safe enough to relax in, but not safe enough to leave him alone. He asked Carl Sizemore, finally, what the original layout of the bedroom floor had been. Carl Sizemore took the John Deere cap off again. He said there was a trapdoor cut into the boards under where the bed used to stand, hand-pegged with white oak pegs. My granddad helped your granddad cut it, the same summer they built the cabin. They cut it for cold storage of what your granddad brought up from his folks still in Tazewell County. 1948. Old enough now to be either a historical artifact or a problem, depending on what's still under it. Carl Sizemore put the cap back on, stood up off the second step, and said he would leave Mason to it. He said if Mason needed anything, he was 3 miles down the Holler in the White House with the blue trim and the chickens out front. He said Mason should consider not opening the trapdoor at night. Then he walked back to his blue Ford and drove away. The amber light went out of the high ridge. Kaiser sat up. Mason looked at the cabin door with its rusted screen and its single padlock on a hasp that he had the key to. And he thought about a man named Dale Everett walking the property line on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when the cousin in Charlotte had told no one that the cabin had a new occupant arriving. He slept that first night under a tarp strung between the porch post and the bur oak, because he was not yet willing to sleep inside the cabin. The October ground was already cold. The temperature on the small thermometer he had clipped to his rucksack strap dropped from 44 to 29 between sundown and 3 in the morning. He had built a small, smokeless fire in a hardwood canopy lay he had learned from a recon master gunnery sergeant in 2007. A Dakota fire hole dug into the loam behind the bur oak, the heat shed laterally through a baffled vent rather than upward through smoke. The hardwood canopy diffused what little vapor escaped. From the ridge above in daylight, you could not have seen a fire was burning. At night, the canopy hid the orange glow. Kaiser lay on his bedroll inside the curve of his arm. She did not sleep. She watched the cabin door. Every 20 minutes or so, her head turned a fraction toward the laurel thicket at the south side of the cabin, and then back to the door. Mason did not turn his head when she did. He had learned not to. A working dog tells you where the threat is by where she puts her eyes, not by what she does with her body. And a handler who keeps following her eyes with his own head announces himself to anything watching the dog. He kept his face up at the canopy and his peripheral vision on what Kaiser was reading. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about what he knew of his grandfather, which was less than he wanted. The man had been 42 when Mason's father was born and 61 when the silicosis put him in the Bluefield ward. There were 2 photographs of him that the family kept, both of them taken before the war. One showed him standing beside a coal shoveling rig at the number 3 with a face so young that Mason had not, the first time he saw it, recognized the man as his own blood. The other showed him on the porch of this cabin in 1952 with Mason's grandmother and a German shepherd lying at his feet. The shepherd's name had been Rex. Carl Sizemore had probably known Rex by his actual name. Mason had not thought to ask. The thing that surprised him, lying under the tarp with the Malinois warm against his ribs and the cold of the October ground coming through the bedroll, was how much of his thinking now ran along bloodlines rather than along teams lines. For 23 years, his frame of reference for any decision had been the unit he was in at the time. SEAL Team 4 for the first 4-year hitch, Team 8 for the bulk of the middle. The MARSOC contract for the last 6 years as an instructor and then as an operator on a rotation he was not supposed to talk about. The unit had been the thing his thinking happened inside. Now he was lying under a tarp on his grandfather's land, and the cousin in Charlotte who held the deed was kin, and the dead renter who had broken his neck on the cellar steps was kin 3 generations removed. And the old man in the John Deere cap who had worked the number 3 with his grandfather was the only person in this holler who had said his grandfather's name out loud in his hearing in 20 years. The unit was 900 miles away and would not be coming up the Holler road behind him. What he had instead was a 1/4 acre of West Virginia hillside and a Malinois and a trapdoor in the bedroom floor. I will tell you here that my own grandfather's brother died of the dust in 1961 in a hospital outside Welch, 3 valleys over from where Mason was lying. The name on the cabin door is not Mason Reeve. I have changed it because the cousin in Charlotte is still alive and is a private man, and because the nephew Dale Everett is also still alive and is a less private man, and because the rest of what happened in this cabin in the autumn after Mason came up the Holler is the kind of thing that should not be told with real names attached. The Holler, the cabin, the trapdoor, the dust, the cold, and the dog are real. The names are mine. Kaiser's head came up. She did not growl. She did not move her body. Her ears went forward and her weight shifted to her front paws, and she looked at the laurel thicket on the south side of the cabin. Mason did not move his head. He looked at the canopy and let his peripheral pick up what she was seeing. There was nothing visible in the laurel. There was no sound except the small, steady fall of hardwood leaves through the late October cold. Kaiser stayed in that pose for almost 2 minutes. Then her ears relaxed and her weight came back, and she lay down again against his ribs. Mason did not sleep after that. He watched the canopy until the eastern edge of it began to gray. Then he stood up, put out the Dakota fire by sifting cold loam into it, rolled the bedroll, and stood at the foot of the porch steps in the first dim light of his first morning on his grandfather's land. He had decided 2 things by sunrise. He was not going to call his cousin in Charlotte until he had been inside the cabin, and he was not going to open the trapdoor in the bedroom floor for the first time after dark. He waited until the sun was a hand's width above the ridge before he opened the screen door. There was no reason to wait that long, and there was every reason. A man enters a closed house the way his body lets him enter it, and his body let him enter at full light. The padlock came off the hasp easily. The screen door he had to lift on its hinges. The inner door was warped at the threshold and required his shoulder. The smell came out before he did. Old creosote, mouse, dry rot in the kitchen lean-to, a thinner, sweet smell underneath that was either cured tobacco or something older that he could not place. Kaiser went in first. She did not go in fast. She moved through the front room in the deliberate quarter pace she used when she was reading what a building remembered. The front room was empty of furniture. The cousin and Charlotte had cleared most of what had belonged to Boyd Everett in 2019 and had sold the chest freezer and the Coleman lanterns to a man at the Princeton flea market. What was left was an iron cookstove in the kitchen lean-to, a deal table with one leg propped on a stack of National Geographic from 1967, and a horsehair couch that had been there since Mason's grandmother's time and that no one had been able to think of a reason to remove. The plank floor was wide-board yellow pine, smoke darkened around where the cookstove had stood. The wallpaper was a wreath pattern in faded green that Mason's eye recognized before his mind did. He had seen it in the 1952 photograph behind his grandfather's shoulder. He stood for a while in the middle of the front room and let himself feel that he was inside a house his grandfather had built. Then he went to work. He went to work the way a teams man clears a structure, not the way a grieving grandson explores one. He swept each room with his eyes from corner to corner and ceiling to floor. He counted exits. He noted the windows that did not latch, the floorboards that gave under his boot, the chimney mast behind the cookstove that still held some faint warmth from the morning sun on the outside flue. The bedroom was through a doorway off the front room. The bedroom contained nothing but a bare iron bed frame with no mattress, and a small chest of drawers with its top drawer pulled out and not put back. Mason did not look at the floor under the bed frame yet. He had decided when to do that, and he was going to do it later. He turned and went out through the kitchen lean-to into the bright, cold morning behind the cabin and walked the perimeter twice with Kaiser. The perimeter was where he found the wires. They were not new wires. They were old single-strand fence wire, the kind a farmer ran around a chicken yard in 1940, and they had been threaded through the laurel thicket on the south side of the cabin in a pattern that ran from the corner of the porch around to the back of the root cellar door. Boyd Everett had hung something on those wires once. There were small, twisted loops at intervals of about 3 feet, the size and spacing of empty soup cans. A trip line of cans and laurel did not announce anybody to the cabin, but it did announce the cabin to whoever was walking through the laurel. The cans were gone. The wire remained. Carl Sizemore had said Boyd had not been found, beaten, or shot in 14 years. Mason looked at the wires and understood that some of Y was on the floor of the bedroom, and some of it was strung in the laurel. He cut the wires. He coiled them and put the coils in the bed of his truck. He did not want anything strung on his grandfather's land that was Boyd Everett's idea. Then he went back into the cabin and started on the kitchen lean-to. The cook stove was repairable. The flue was clean. The lean-to ceiling needed 2 boards. The window over the sink was cracked in one pane and would have to be reglazed before the first hard freeze. He worked at it through the rest of the morning, with Kaiser lying in the open doorway between the lean-to and the front room, and he did not think about the trapdoor. He found the letters in the afternoon, behind the 3rd course of fieldstone in the chimney mass. He was not looking for letters. He was looking at how the mason in 1948 had set the chimney into the corner of the kitchen lean-to, because he wanted to understand whether the flue would draft properly if he started a fire in the cookstove that night. The mason had set the chimney shoulder out from the cabin wall by about 4 inches, the way a telemark stonemason would set it, to let the south face of the chimney warm the kitchen wall through radiant heat. Mason ran his fingers along the joints, looking for the heat transfer setbacks, and his second finger pressed against a stone that moved. He moved the stone an inch with his thumb. There was a cavity behind it the size of a tobacco tin. There was a tobacco tin in the cavity. It was a Prince Albert can, the old red kind, with the lid pressed down tight by a folded strip of cardboard wedge. The cardboard had not been touched in 77 years. Mason pulled the tin out, set it on the kitchen table, and sat down on the prop leg side because his right knee had started to complain again. Kaiser came over and put her chin on his thigh. He opened the tin. The tin held 9 folded letters in a small enamel medal of St. Barbara, patron saint of miners. The letters were on lined notebook paper, written in the careful, crabbed pencil of a man who had not finished high school, but had been taught by a Pocahontas Fuel Company foreman's wife to write a paragraph. They were dated between February of 1948 and October of 1948. They were addressed to his grandmother, Della Mae Reeves, at a post office box in Bishop, West Virginia. They were not letters that had been mailed because they had not been put in envelopes, and because the post office in Bishop was a mile down the Holler road from where his grandfather had been standing when he wrote them. They were the letters his grandfather had written in his own kitchen, while his wife was asleep in the next room, in the year he was building this cabin and learning at the same time that the dust at the number 3 was not going to leave him alone. Mason read the first one. His grandfather had written that the doctor at the company clinic in Bishop had listened to his chest on a Tuesday morning in February and had told him that what he could hear was the early shadow of what the specialists down in Bluefield called silicosis pneumoconiosis, stage 1. The doctor had said that with care and with luck, the early shadow could stay an early shadow for 10 or 15 years. The doctor had said that without care, the early shadow could thicken inside too. His grandfather had written to his wife in pencil on lined paper that he had decided not to tell her. He had written that he had decided to build the cabin instead. He had written that he wanted his wife to have a house that was hers when the dust took him, and that he wanted his son, who was 3 years old in 1948, to grow up under a roof that his father had laid with his own hands. He had written that he was sorry for not telling her, and that he intended to tell her on a day he could not yet name, and that he did not know how he would find the words. Mason read the second letter. He read the third. He read all 9 of them straight through, with Kaiser's chin on his thigh and the late afternoon light coming in slant through the kitchen window. By the 7th letter, his grandfather had moved past the dust and was writing about what kind of joinery he was using on the door frames, and why he wanted the chimney shouldered out, and why he was setting the bedroom floor on 2-inch sleeper joists instead of 1-inch. Because he had been told by a man named Sizemore that an old Tazewell County trick was a cold storage trap in the bedroom floor, and his cousin in Tazewell was sending up 6 gallons of clear in October that he wanted to keep cold through the winter without putting it in the cellar, where any federal man could find it on a walkthrough. The trapdoor letter was the 7th letter. The dust letter was the 1st. The 9th letter was 3 sentences long. It said, "I told her this morning. She made coffee. She asked me how long, and I told her what the doctor said. She did not cry. We sat at this table for an hour. She held my hand. Then she went out to the chickens, and I went down to the number 3. Mason set the letter down. He sat at the same table where his grandfather had written the sentence about coffee. He did not say anything to the dog. He was 46 years old. He had buried 3 teammates with full honors at Arlington and 1 teammate at a private burial at his mother's parish in Pennsylvania. And he had not, in any of those 4 cases, sat down at a table afterward and felt what he felt now, which was the small, specific weight of a man he had never properly known sitting beside him at his elbow, and not, in any sense Mason could name, leaving. He waited until full daylight the next morning to open the trap door. He had said he would, and he did. He pulled the iron bed frame out of the bedroom and set it on the porch. He swept the plank floor with the corn husk broom that had been propped behind the kitchen door since some unknown date. The trapdoor showed itself in the swept floor as a square outline, 28 inches on a side, set 6 inches in from the south wall of the bedroom. The pegs were where Carl Sizemore had said they would be, white oak, 4 to each side, hand-driven and slightly proud of the floorboards. They've been driven and pulled and driven again many times over 7 decades. Mason worked the pegs out with the back of a wood chisel. He set them on the windowsill in the order they had come out, the way his grandfather had probably set them when he cut the trap in 1948. Then he lifted the trap door. The cold storage well below the trap door was a square pit, dry stoned with creek rock, about 30 inches deep, with a flagstone floor. It was clean. It was empty of anything his grandfather had put in it. What it held instead was the apparatus of a man who had used the well for 17 years, between 2003 and 2019. A small 12-volt battery on a wooden block, a length of copper coil tied with picture wire, a folded canvas bag that proved when he opened it to hold 1 quart jar of clear corn liquor, sealed with wax, and 3 smaller jars of what looked like seed corn from a burpee tin, but was not seed corn when he tipped one of the jars toward the light. The jar held a fine yellow grit that he recognized from a counter-narcotics briefing in 2017 as methamphetamine, of the kind that the West Virginia Attorney General's office had been calling, in their public statements that year, finished product ready for distribution. Mason put the jar back where he had found it. He sat on his heels at the edge of the trapdoor with his right knee straight out and his left elbow on his left knee, and he looked at the canvas bag for a long minute. Then he stood up, lifted the trapdoor closed without latching it, walked out of the bedroom, walked out of the cabin, walked across the porch, and stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked at the Holler road, where Carl Sizemore had driven away in the blue Ford the previous afternoon. Kaiser came out of the cabin behind him and sat at his right boot. He understood several things at once. He understood why Dale Everett had walked the property line on a Tuesday afternoon when no one had told him the cabin had a new occupant. He understood why Dale Everett had asked Carl Sizemore about the bedroom floor layout. He understood why a man with a broken neck and a blood alcohol of 0.31 had been found at the bottom of the cellar steps in November of 2019, when the apparatus that man cared about most was in a stone pit 30 inches under the bedroom floor with a trap door over it. Mason had seen accidents in low-light stairways before. He had also seen men staged to look like accidents in low-light stairways before. He did not, on his first morning of consideration, know which Boyd Everett's death had been. He understood that the question mattered. He also understood that the answer to the question was probably going to come up the Holler road in some form within 5 days, because Dale Everett's nephew did not walk a property line on a Tuesday afternoon in late October without a calendar in his head. He walked back into the cabin. He went to the bedroom. He took the jar of corn liquor and the 3 small jars of yellow grit and put them in a heavy-duty contractor bag from his truck. He took the 12-volt battery and the copper coil and put them in the same bag. He drove the 4 miles down the Holler to Carl Sizemore's white house with the blue trim and the chickens out front, with Kaiser in the passenger seat and the bag on the floorboard. And he asked Carl Sizemore one question, which was whether the sheriff of McDowell County was the kind of man who solved a problem at the courthouse or the kind of man who let a problem solve itself in a holler. Carl Sizemore did not answer for a while. He looked at the bag on Mason's floorboard from across the porch railing, with his hands in the pockets of his canvas barn coat, and finally he said, "Sheriff's gone to Charleston for an emergency board meeting Wednesday and Thursday. He'll not be back until Friday morning. His younger brother's been running things out of the department this week. His younger brother's still up at the cousins, still 3 hollers over toward the Wyoming County line." Mason said he understood. Carl Sizemore looked at Mason for another long moment. He said, "Son, your granddad would have wanted you to call the state police in Welch this afternoon. But your granddad died a long time ago, and the state police won't get here before sundown tomorrow, and Dale Everett's nephew works second shift at the Princeton Hospital and gets off at 11 o'clock tonight. That's the math I would do, was it me?" Then Carl Sizemore went into his house and closed the door behind him, and Mason drove back up the Holler with the contractor bag on the floorboard and the Malinois on the passenger seat, in approximately 36 hours, by his count, until Dale Everett would be off shift and looking at the Holler road. He drove the bag to the state trooper barracks in Welch before he did anything else. He did not call ahead. He pulled into the gravel lot at 1 in the afternoon, walked through the front door with the contractor bag in his right hand and his MARSOC discharge in his left, and he put both on the duty corporal's desk. The corporal was 25 years old and had been on the desk for 40 minutes. He looked at the discharge paperwork. He looked at the bag. He went and got the senior trooper on shift, a heavy man in his 50s named Wilkerson, with 28 years on the West Virginia State Police. And Wilkerson sat with Mason in the back room for an hour and asked him questions and wrote down answers in a blue spiral notebook with a courthouse pen. Wilkerson did not promise anything fast. He said the lab in Charleston would have to confirm the yellow grit before any warrant could be sworn out. He said that if Dale Everett's nephew was the man Mason thought he was, then the nephew was the kind of man the state police had been watching from a distance for 2 years without enough to charge him with. He said the sheriff's brother was a separate problem and a known problem, and that the McDowell sheriff himself was not in the brother's business but did not have the votes at home to put his own brother in a county cell. Wilkerson said he would have a unit at the Holler mouth at 6 o'clock the following morning, which was 18 hours after Carl Sizemore's 11 o'clock estimate of when Dale would come off shift. Wilkerson said this was the best he could offer with the magistrate on a Wednesday afternoon and the lab 2 hours drive each way. He said Mason should not, in the interval, open his door to anyone who was not in a state police uniform, and that he should not, if he could help it, leave the cabin between sundown tonight and 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Mason said he understood. He drove back up the Holler with the bag gone, and the receipt for the bag in the inside pocket of his jacket, and the Malinois on the passenger seat, watching the tree lines. The receipt was a single sheet of carbon paper with Trooper Wilkerson's signature and the lab tracking number and the time of intake, and a description of contents that read, in Wilkerson's blocky pencil, 1 quart jar clear ethanol distillate, 3 jars granular yellow substance suspected methamphetamine hydrochloride, 1 12-volt battery, 1 copper coil approximate length 7 feet. Mason folded the receipt twice and put it in the breast pocket of his shirt and not in the glove box of the truck. A receipt in the glove box of a truck parked outside a coal camp cabin in McDowell County was not a receipt that would help anyone if anyone needed the receipt later. He spent the rest of the afternoon doing what he had been trained to do since 2004. He cleared his cabin. He nailed 2 of the kitchen lean-to boards he had been planning to nail next week. He latched the warped inner door from the inside with a wooden bar he cut from a piece of 2x4. He set the trapdoor in the bedroom floor down empty, with the white oak pegs not driven, so that anyone who came looking for the apparatus would find the well empty, and would have to consider whether that was a problem the cabin's new occupant had made, or a problem someone else had made before him. He moved his bedroll out of the front room and into the loft above, where the floor was sound and the single window faced the Holler road and the laurel thicket through a shooter's notch in the eaves that his grandfather had cut in 1948 for reasons Mason had not understood until that afternoon. He set Kaiser's water bowl at the top of the loft ladder. The temperature on the porch thermometer at 4:30 in the afternoon read 51 degrees. By 6 o'clock, with the sun behind the ridge, it read 43. By 8 o'clock, it read 36. By 10 o'clock, it read 31, and Kaiser had not eaten the food Mason had put in her bowl, which was how Kaiser told him she had decided to work the night. She heard the truck at 12:40 in the morning. Mason heard it at 12:40 and 2 seconds, when Kaiser came up off the loft floor and put her front paws on the windowsill of the shooter's notch without making a sound. The truck was coming up the Holler road in low gear with no headlights. It was a long wheelbase truck. He could tell by the lag between the front wheels clearing a frost heave and the rear wheels clearing the same heave. And it was pulling something, because the engine was working harder than it should for an empty bed. The truck did not stop at the gate. It stopped at the last laurel turn before the gate, 220 yards down the Holler road, and the engine cut. Mason did not move from the loft. He had moved into the loft 6 hours earlier for exactly this reason. He listened. He counted footfalls. 3 men, maybe 4. They were walking up the Holler road in soft boots, not work boots, and they were spread out, not bunched, which meant they were not drunk, which meant the math Carl Sizemore had done at his porch railing the day before had been the right math. A drunk crew would have driven the truck up to the gate with the headlights on and would have stood at the porch and shouted for Boyd's nephew's inheritance like a man shouting for change. A sober crew on foot at 12:40 in the morning was a different kind of business. Mason watched the laurel thicket on the south side of the cabin through the shooter's notch and waited. Kaiser did not bark. She did not growl. She put her chin on the windowsill of the notch and watched the same laurel Mason was watching, and her tail did not move. The first shape came through the laurel at 12:46. He was about Mason's height, wearing a dark canvas jacket and a knitted cap, and he had something in his right hand that Mason could not yet identify. The second shape came through 10 seconds later, 10 feet to the first shape's left. The third came up between them in another 10 seconds. The fourth did not come through the laurel at all. The fourth stayed at the truck, which meant the fourth was the driver, which meant Mason had 3 men to think about and not 4. The first shape stopped at the corner of the porch and put his hand on the porch post. He looked at the cabin door. He looked at the bedroom window. He looked at the kitchen window. He looked back at the laurel. The second shape came up beside him. The third stayed behind the cabin, which Mason could tell because he could hear the third one's footfalls on the slope behind the root cellar. Mason did not move. The bar across the warped inner door was holding. The single padlock on the screen door was holding. The shooter's notch in the loft eave was the only opening into the cabin that the men outside did not know about, and Mason was the only person in the cabin looking out through it. From the Laurel side, the cabin looked like a closed coal camp cabin on a quarter-acre with no occupant. The first shape walked up the porch steps. He stopped on the third step, the one that had killed Mason's grandfather, or near enough to it, and he turned his head and listened. He did not knock on the door. He put his right hand to the screen door and tested the padlock. He said something to the second shape that Mason could not hear from the loft. Then he went to the side of the porch, leaned over the railing, and looked at the bedroom window. The bedroom window was unlatched, because Mason had unlatched it that afternoon and had not relatched it. The first shape worked the window open with the tip of what Mason now could see was a pry bar. Mason waited. He was breathing through his nose. His right hand was on the carbine he had brought up to the loft, and the carbine was loaded, but the safety was on, and his finger was indexed along the receiver and not on the trigger. He was waiting for the first shape to be all the way inside the bedroom, with the second shape committed to the porch, and the third shape committed to the rear, before he made any sound at all. The first shape put one leg over the windowsill. He brought the other leg over. He turned, hung from the sill by his hands for a fraction of a second, and dropped to the bedroom floor. He landed soft. He had done this before, in this exact window, more than once, which made him almost certainly Boyd Everett's nephew Dale, and made the previous time he had done it almost certainly the November night in 2019 that had ended at the bottom of the cellar steps with a broken neck and a recorded blood alcohol of 0.31. Mason gave him 5 seconds. Then Kaiser made the sound he had asked her to make, which was a single, low growl from the loft above the bedroom. Low enough that Dale Everett would hear it inside the bedroom, but the second and third shapes outside would not. The growl said, to anyone who knew Belgian Malinois work, that a serious dog had been inside this cabin the entire time, and that the serious dog was directly above the man who had just come through the window. What happened next happened in 7 seconds. Dale Everett froze. He was a man who had broken his own uncle's neck on a set of cellar steps and walked out of the cabin with the property line in his head. And he was not, when frozen, a particularly fast thinker. He looked up at the loft. He could not see Kaiser because Kaiser was set back 2 feet from the loft hatch, with the geometry of the angle hiding her. He could see the loft ladder. He took 1 step toward the loft ladder. Mason came down off the ladder rung he had been balanced on, slid the bar off the inner door with his left hand, and was through the bedroom doorway with the carbine up before Dale Everett's second step. On the floor, Mason said. He said it once. He did not say it loud. The carbine's red dot was steady on the center of Dale Everett's sternum from a range of 11 feet. Kaiser came down the ladder behind him in 3 controlled drops without using her front legs at all, the way her handlers had taught her to come off a vehicle in a controlled drop, and she stopped 2 feet behind Mason's right boot in the high alert posture she would hold until told otherwise. Dale Everett looked at Mason. He looked at the dog. He looked at the carbine. He went to the floor. He went face down. He put his hands behind his head without being told. The second shape came through the front room door from the porch. He had a shotgun. He saw Mason and the carbine and the dog, and he stopped in the doorway with the shotgun at port arms, and he did not bring it up because Mason did not need to look at him to know where his red dot was already moving. Set it down, Mason said. Slow. Step on it. Step back through the door. Sit on the porch with your hands on your knees. The dog will know if you move them. The second shape did all 4 things in the order he was told. He did not say anything. He was thinner than Dale and younger by some years, and he was either Dale's cousin or one of the sheriff's brother's men. And either way, he was not going to be the third shape's problem. The third shape was still behind the cabin. The third shape had heard nothing because the loft growl had not carried through the rear wall, and because the carbine had not been fired, and because Mason had not raised his voice. Mason gestured Kaiser into the front room. He gestured her to the back wall of the front room, which was the wall between the front room and the kitchen lean-to. She put her ear against the lower edge of the wall and held the alert. After 18 seconds, she made the small head shift that meant the third shape was moving along the rear of the cabin from the cellar side toward the kitchen lean-to door. Mason did not engage the third shape from inside. He had Dale on the bedroom floor and the second shape on the porch with the shotgun at his feet, and the third shape was the cleanup man, who had to be left to the state troopers. He pulled the bar back across the inner door with his left hand. He flicked the porch light on with his right elbow as he passed the switch. The porch light was a 60-watt bulb that Carl Sizemore's father had installed in 1948, and that still worked on a fresh bulb. The third shape, in the dark behind the cabin, saw the porch light come on and made the calculation a cleanup man makes when his front shapes have not given him the all clear at the appointed second. He ran for the Laurel. Mason heard him through the rear wall, going hard through the brush downhill toward the truck at the Laurel turn. The truck started 2 minutes later and drove away down the Holler road at speed without lights. The driver had not waited for the third shape. The driver had made his own calculation. The third shape was now on foot in the Laurel above the Holler road at 1:28 in the morning in 31-degree weather with no truck and no shotgun and a county he did not know. Mason did not move from inside the cabin. He stayed on Dale Everett's sternum with the carbine and on the second shape's chest with Kaiser's attention through the porch door, and he waited. The state trooper Wilkerson had said 6 o'clock at the Holler mouth. It was now 1:29. 5.5 hours of holding the cabin with 2 men contained and 1 man loose in the Laurel was the shape of the night. The shooter's notch in the loft eave faced the right direction. The grandfather had cut it for the right reason. Mason had not known until that afternoon that the reason had been this reason. He waited. Kaiser waited. The porch light burned. Wilkerson's unit came up the Holler road at 5:53 in the morning with the lights off. There were 3 cruisers and an unmarked sedan. The sedan held 2 men from the state lab in Charleston who had been driven out by an off-duty trooper at 3 in the morning when Wilkerson had been raised on his radio by the duty corporal at Welch and told that the callback from the field would be coming in earlier than expected. They did not run the lights up the Holler, because Wilkerson had told the duty corporal not to. The first cruiser pulled into the gate at 5:55. Mason came out onto the porch with his hands visible, the carbine slung muzzle down on his back, and Kaiser at his right boot. He did not say anything until Wilkerson was out of the second cruiser and at the bottom of the porch steps. Wilkerson looked at the second shape sitting on the porch with his hands on his knees and his shotgun on the boards at his feet. He looked at the open bedroom window. He looked at Mason. He said, "How many inside?" Mason said 1 inside on the bedroom floor, face down, hands behind his head. He said the third one had gone for the Laurel at 12:48, and the truck at the Laurel turn had left without him at 12:51. Wilkerson nodded once. He sent the third trooper, a young woman whose name tag read Pruitt, around to the rear of the cabin with a flashlight to start the perimeter. He sent the first trooper through the front door to lift Dale Everett off the bedroom floor and cuff him. He went up the porch steps himself, stepped over the second shape's shotgun, and walked into Mason's grandfather's front room for the first time in 28 years of working McDowell County. Wilkerson stood for a moment in the middle of the front room with his hands on his duty belt and looked at the wallpaper. He said in a quieter voice, "I came up here once in 1997 when I was on the beat. There was a domestic at the next Holler over, and I cut through your granddad's parcel on horseback because the road was washed. The cabin was empty then. I remember this wallpaper." Mason said his grandmother had hung the wallpaper in 1948. Wilkerson looked at it for another second and then went into the bedroom to talk to Dale Everett. The lab men found the third shape 3 hours later in a deadfall above the Holler road, 2 miles south of the cabin, with mild hypothermia and a sprained left ankle. He had tried to walk out across the ridge in the dark and had not made it past the first wash. He gave Trooper Pruitt his name without being asked, because by sunrise he had decided that being found by the state police in a deadfall was a better outcome than being found by the sheriff's brother across the county line. And he was right about that, in the sense that mattered to him. He was also one of the sheriff's brother's men, which meant the sheriff's brother had a problem on Friday morning when the sheriff got back from Charleston that the sheriff's brother was not going to be able to talk his way out of from the inside of the courthouse. By 9 in the morning, the cabin had 3 state troopers, 2 labmen, an ambulance from the Welch Hospital, and Trooper Wilkerson standing in the kitchen lean-to drinking coffee Mason had made on the iron cook stove with a percolator he had bought at a hardware store in Beckley 4 days earlier. The lab men were photographing the empty cold storage well and the trapdoor and the unlatched bedroom window in the order Mason described to them. The cuffed second shape, who had given his name as Devin Stiltner of Welch, sat in the back of the first cruiser without complaint. Dale Everett sat in the back of the second cruiser without speaking. Wilkerson did not ask Mason any questions inside the cabin that he had not already asked at the Welch barracks the day before, which was the kind of restraint Mason had learned to appreciate from old-school police work in the 23 years he had been on the receiving end of the other kind. Carl Sizemore came up the Holler Road at 9:15 in the blue Ford. He had with him an aluminum baking dish covered with foil that held what proved to be cornbread baked at 5:30 that morning. He set the dish on the porch railing. He did not come up the steps. He looked at the cruisers, and at the cuffed men in the cruisers, and at the cabin, and at Mason. He said, "You called the troopers." Mason said he had. Carl Sizemore nodded slowly. He said, "Your granddad's son would have called the troopers." Mason did not answer. Carl Sizemore stood for another minute on the Holler Road side of the porch railing, with his hands in his canvas barn coat pockets. And then he said, "You can come for supper tonight if you want. My wife makes a good country ham. The dog's welcome." Then he got back into the blue Ford and drove down the Holler. The troopers and the labmen were gone by noon. They took the two cuffed men and the third shape from the deadfall, and the shotgun and the pry bar, and the wires Mason had coiled from the laurel thicket, and Mason's signed statement, and Wilkerson's blue spiral notebook. They left the cabin to Mason. Kaiser lay down across the bedroom doorway and closed her eyes for the first time in 22 hours. He did not sleep at the cabin that afternoon. He sat at the deal table with the propped leg, and he opened the tobacco tin one more time, and he read the 9th letter again, the 3-sentence one about the coffee. Then he put the letter back in the tin, set the St. Barbara medal on top of the letters, pressed the lid down, and put the tin back into the chimney cavity. He moved the fieldstone back into place. He pressed it home with the heel of his hand until it sat flush with its neighbors. The chimney had held the tin for 77 years and was going to hold it for as long as the chimney stood, which was a span of time that did not need to be specified. He went out into the bright, cold afternoon and walked the 4 corners of the parcel. He walked them slowly because his right knee was complaining badly after the long night. He walked them slowly also because he wanted to know what corner of land he was inside. The parcel was 4 acres exactly. The northeast corner was a granite survey marker set in 1908 by the original Pocahontas Fuel Company surveyors. The southeast corner was an iron pin driven by the same survey crew. The southwest corner was a cairn of fieldstone that Mason's grandfather had stacked himself in 1948 in lieu of a pin, because Mason's grandfather had not trusted any pin he had not driven with his own hands, and the cairn had outlasted his trust by 77 years. The northwest corner was the bur oak, under which Mason's grandmother and grandfather were buried. Mason stood at the bur oak for a while. There were 2 flat fieldstones at the base of it, both with names carved in by hand in a stonecutter's chisel script that the Welch Monument Company had done as a favor to Mason's grandmother in 1956, and again, the same favor in 1989. The names had weathered but were still legible. There was room at the base of the bur oak for at least one more stone. Mason did not, standing there, decide that the room would be his. He noted that the room was there. He noted that his cousin and Charlotte would need to know that fact about the parcel before the cousin made any decision about the $46,000 from the holding company. The Forest Extension's lifetime usage right that did not transfer suddenly had a different shape inside his thinking than it had had 4 days earlier. He drove down to Carl Sizemore's white house at 6 in the evening. Mrs. Sizemore was a slight woman of 72 in a print apron with a face that had laughed at a great many things and grieved at a smaller but still considerable number. She greeted Mason at the door, called Kaiser by sight as the working dog, and put both of them at the kitchen table without asking what either of them wanted to drink. There was country ham, there were biscuits. There were green beans cooked the way Mason's grandmother had cooked them in 1989, with bacon fat and a little vinegar, which was a way of cooking green beans Mason had not realized until that moment he had remembered at all. Carl Sizemore poured Mason a small glass of clear corn liquor from a mason jar on the counter and said, in passing, that it was not the kind of clear that had been under the bedroom floor. It was his cousin's, and his cousin paid his federal excise tax. Mason said he was glad to hear it. Carl Sizemore said his cousin had been paying it since 2011, and that his cousin slept easy at night, which was, he said, the point. They did not talk about the night at the cabin during supper. They talked about the number 3 drift mine and about the men who had worked it with Mason's grandfather, and about which of them had ended up where. Carl Sizemore had a memory for names. He went through the 7 other men on the shovel crew of 1951 and told Mason where each of them had died, and what year and of what. 5 of the 7 had died of silicosis, including Mason's grandfather. 1 had died on the floor of the mine itself, in a roof fall in 1963. 1, a man named Burgess, had outlived all the others, had moved to Cleveland to work for the auto plants, had come back to McDowell County in 1986 to die of a heart attack in his own driveway at the age of 72, and was buried in the company cemetery at Bishop. Carl Sizemore said Burgess had been a friend of Mason's grandfather, and that they had played a banjo and a fiddle together on Saturday nights on this porch through the autumn of 1951. Mason had not known his grandfather had played a banjo. He had not known there had been Saturday nights with a fiddle in the next chair. He filed both facts away. After supper, when Kaiser had been given a small bowl of cornbread and ham trimmings on the kitchen floor that Mrs. Sizemore did not consider unsuitable for the working dog, Mason and Carl sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the wind move through the ridge above the house. Carl Sizemore said, after a long minute, "Are you going to keep the cabin?" Mason said he was. Carl Sizemore nodded. He said, "Your cousin in Charlotte is a reasonable man. He'll take less than 46 for a kin price." Mason said he would call his cousin in the morning. Carl Sizemore said, "There's a thing I did not tell you yesterday on your porch. I was not sure yesterday whether you would stay. I will tell you now if you want me to." Mason said yes. Carl Sizemore said, "Your granddad asked my granddad in 1948, after he cut the trapdoor and after he set the chimney, whether my granddad would help him cut the shooter's notch in the loft eave. My granddad helped him. They cut it because your granddad had heard from a man in Bishop that there was a kind of trouble that comes up a Holler road in a coal camp parcel in McDowell County, and your granddad wanted his son to be able to look out that notch in a year his son might need to. The son never needed to. The grandson did." Mason did not answer for a while. He looked at the chickens settling for the night in the wire run beside the house. He said he was grateful to Carl Sizemore. Carl Sizemore said nothing more, and they sat for another half hour, and then Mason drove back up the Holler with Kaiser on the passenger seat and the porch light of the Sizemore house dwindling in the rearview mirror. He slept inside the cabin that night for the first time. He spread his bedroll on the bedroom floor next to where the trapdoor sat without its pegs, because he had not yet driven the pegs back. He set Kaiser's blanket between the bedroll and the door. He turned off the porch light. He banked the cook stove low. The temperature on the bedroom thermometer at 11 o'clock read 58, and at 4 in the morning read 51, and by dawn read 48, which was a workable margin for a cabin without storm windows in late October up on the ridge. The wind moved across the ridge through the latter half of the night, and the hardwood leaves came down in steady, small percussion onto the cabin roof. Kaiser slept with her ribs against Mason's. Mason slept 7 hours. He had not slept 7 hours in one piece since 2020. I will tell you here that the cabin still stands. The forest extension agreement was signed the following March, on terms Mason's cousin in Charlotte accepted, because Carl Sizemore drove down to Charlotte himself in the blue Ford to explain to the cousin what a kin price was, and why this particular cabin was the kind of cabin that needed to be one. The cousin sold his half of the deed to Mason for $22,000, which was less than half the holding company's offer. The cousin sent the check from the sale to a hospice fund in Bluefield in his uncle's name. Mason kept the